I've done about 20 years of human rights research, academic research, lecturing, teaching, publishing, etc. But I felt there was something missing, and a colleague of mine introduced the idea of a podcast when podcasts were not particularly well known. And I realized that the podcast offers a perfect medium for a deeper conversation about human rights. And it allowed me to reach out to a research community that had traditionally been publishing, teaching, and going to conferences, but it gave them the opportunity to talk about the research in a meaningful way and to connect with audiences that they hadn't connected with before.
Welcome to the Rights Track Podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today.
So I wanted to focus on how do we get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today by talking to researchers working on human rights problems, and how, by talking to those people, could we get people on the right track in thinking about human rights.
Giving voice and bearing witness, those two things are absolutely critical.
I thought thematically about what is it that I'm trying to do as a scholar in human rights. How could I structure a podcast in a way that was thematically organized across a series and episodes? But then I discovered that actually there's a lot more to organizing a podcast than just thinking about what it is you want to talk about. You need a brand identity, you need a website, you need some of the technical back-end activity so that when people find you on the website, everything works, but also they're drawn to the website through the visual identity, through the branding, as well as through the content. So there's a lot of forethought required, a lot of planning before you even record your first podcast, and you need to think about how all that's going to be pulled together. And it does take some financial resource to be able to do that. Podcasts can reach new audiences that hadn't thought about human rights before, or at least they thought about them, but they don't want to read all the tomes to understand them. A podcast is a really efficient way to get people the hard facts about human rights and what the challenges are in the world and how we can do something about it. The true benefits for an academic can be many things. First of all, you meet people you've never met before. People approach you who would never approach you before. And actually, one example from my experience is that someone wrote to me and said, I really liked your podcast. I like your focus on statistics. I'm a statistician. Would you like to write something together? Now, in the end, we ended up writing a paper in the Journal of Risk Research on the risks of the COVID pandemic on the holding of free and fair elections. So there was an outcome by somebody who had just listened to the podcast, listened to what I was asking my guests. And there are other collaborations that come out of that. We have done some training sessions with our early career researchers. They're really enthused about podcasts. They're in a generation that likes the technology, but at the same time, they see the real potential of podcasts. And that's not only dissemination of what it is that they're researching, but it's also about their pathways to impact, because policymakers will listen to podcasts because a podcast medium is a short, sharp articulation of many more complex ideas, and policymakers can listen when they're on the train and they say, actually, I'm going to go talk to that researcher because they have something that we didn't know about that would be relevant to the work that we're doing. And so it's a tremendous opportunity for anybody to get the word out, to connect with people, to build networks, and to continue to develop their own work in any area that they might be interested in. So many guests, so many people talking to us, but I was reflecting on one podcast recently because we interviewed Monica Casper from the United States about women's rights, and it was right after the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And she was deeply worried about the state of reproductive rights and women's rights more generally in the United States and what might happen over the period of the Trump presidency. And I was really reflecting on the recent midterm elections in the United States in 2022, a full 6 years after that election. And here, of course, we see the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, but also a pushback from the electorate in many states across the United States saying, actually, that set of rights is really important to us, and it really did affect the outcome of that election. There was a bit of sort of intentionality behind my guest selection, but there was also a lot of improvisation. So in the middle of a series, we might find someone would write to the team and say, I'd like to be on your podcast. If there was a goodness of fit, we would interview those people. After the podcast would wrap up, I would think, oh my God, we've spoken to this person. I now want to speak to this person. And we would approach that person, get them on the podcast, and then keep going. And at the same time, we could also respond to current events as they were happening and anticipate milestones in the human rights calendar. So, for example, International Human Rights Day on the 10th of December, we would always have a launch of a new series on that day. Equally, when current events were developing, we did a thing that we called newsjacking. So if there was a story in the newspaper that looked really good and it was relevant to our podcast, we would use our social media to say, this story is really interesting. Have you thought about listening to this podcast that addresses that in much more detail? So in a way, we were kind of adding to the conversation, contributing to the flow of information, at the same time driving new audiences to our podcast. I got to talk to people in a different way that A, I'd never spoken to before, or B, I'd spoken to in a much different context, at a conference or some sort of panel discussion. But to have them on the podcast, ask them the questions that I really wanted to ask them, to probe deeper into the work that they had done, was just a joy for me to be able to understand where they were coming from and what they'd done. The other thing I found really interesting about the podcast that added value to my understanding is not only learning about the unstinting commitment of scholars in human rights and that fine line between the academy and advocacy, activist, scholar activist idea, is that a lot of our people who came on the podcast had never done it before, and to ask them to express what they were doing in the ways that we did was something they'd never done. So they learned and I learned from that process. But at the same time, even though we recorded a lot of single episodes, single conversations with people, what we found through looking across the podcast is those people were talking to one another without even knowing it. And there's almost a golden thread that runs through all of our podcasts where we see a conversation not only between the host and the guest, but between guests themselves. You never know who's listening to the podcast. So we have seen evidence of people building new networks, building new collaborations. And I have to say the content on modern slavery was something that 3 years of series on modern slavery allowed us to talk to policymakers, to people in the House of Lords, to religious figures, to NGO leaders, to a whole bunch of people in this world of trying to combat modern slavery, which brought to bear tremendous new conversations, new evidence, and raised awareness of this very real problem. In the middle of doing 7 years of podcasts, I think it was year 5 or 6, I came up with this idea that, oh my gosh, we have so much rich content here. Wouldn't it be interesting to close the loop and come back to the written word? I got the idea to write a book. I pitched it to Anthem Press. They were really excited about the project. And then in the middle of pitching the book, the pandemic happened. And we thought we have to do a series on COVID. And during that, we then thought we'll do a 7th series on human rights in the digital world. And we did all that while writing the book. And in the end, 96,000 words came out, 255 pages, and the book was published in July of 2022. We had over 26 hours of recordings, over 70 guests, 65 podcasts, and there was so much rich content, so many audience members that enjoyed the podcast, and then finally wrapping everything up into a book with a full statement of what we learned and why it matters seemed like a natural point to end. But the bittersweet element is I miss talking to people, I miss doing the recordings, I don't miss all the scheduling, I have to say, but it was such an enjoyable experience, and I would urge others to take the plunge.